So let's wait till 80. Actually, I'm bored. Let's change this to 78. So 78, 79, 80. Notice how fast 79 and then 80 came at like the same time. That's because 80 was so quick to establish that connection. It just jumped right in there and was like, yeah, it's open. That we really don't need, that thread didn't have to, not that thread, sorry, it's not a thread yet. That socket didn't have to like close or anything. It didn't have to wait for a timeout. It just said, yep, we're open, and then it moved on. So let's be good and close our socket like that. Good socket practice. It's like, you haven't used your socket. Actually, I've used it for a ton. But let's multi-thread this. Let's make it into something more than what it currently is. So we're going to put this in the port thread over here. Let's start I at 1 again, not 0. We'll start I at 0 because I just said not to. And then we'll create a new thread of this, our port thread. Now our port thread class right now is pretty bare, so I'm going to populate it with some code. That code's going to be a little bit more extensive than the previous one because it does include a couple things that it needs to do in order to be a thread, in order to be able to be instantiated as a thread, initialized as a thread, whatever you want to call it, but it's going to be basically the same thing. And so that code that I just X'd out, I did Control X, I cut it, we'll be able to put that right back in there, maybe edit a couple things. So we're going to create a private string called host and a private int called port. The port's going to hold whatever port we're going to scan. The host string is going to contain the host we're scanning. Localhost 192.168.0.6, 192.168.2.4, whatever. So it'll scan that port, and those two will be provided during construction. So because that, we'll do our constructor public port thread string host and int port, because we want to. Those are the construction parameters passed to it. That's when you create the object and you pass two parameters. That's what these are. You have to pass a string and then an integer, and it'll sort it all out. So you want to do this.host equals host and this.port equals port. And what this keyword does, I was going to say what this keyword does, and it's like, what? It's basically saying this class variable. So this.host is this equals host, which is this. If you don't want to worry about the confusion with the this Java keyword, just do private string host, private int port, and then here do host to scan, port to scan. And so then there will be no name confusion. You won't have to use the this keyword. It's just pro tip if you want to do that and be fancy. So that's the end of our constructor, actually. Constructor is very, very simple. Now we're going to want to write a run method now. Public void run. Run is closely related to threads. Thread.start calls run, essentially. So let's just paste our previous code in there. Now, I'm going to show you something interesting here in just a second. Port plus port, port plus port. If I was to run this right now, this in itself, it would do absolutely nothing because it doesn't have a main class. So you can't call a method in it if you don't run anything that does have a main class, unless you're talking about applets. But we're not talking about those right now, and honestly, I probably won't ever cover applets, or at least I don't really intend to, because one, they're kind of fading out, and two, there's really not much use for them. Java Web Start's kind of a better solution a lot of the times, but whatever. Anyway, I digress. But main program isn't instantiating it at all. This isn't being instantiated. These aren't being populated. This isn't being run, so we don't expect anything to really come out anyway. But it's a good way to compile to make sure everything checks out. So we'll want to put up here, port thread extends thread. That gives it the ability to be a thread, basically. It extends thread, so it builds on top of thread. Thread is a specific thing in Java, like we've talked about what a thread is, and so you will want to keep that extends thread in there. You want to put that in. And so let's, and then after we close, we can just return. Don't need it to keep it running. We can just return it there. And I think now we'll go into how you actually create the thread. So to create a thread, you'll do something along the line of, we called it port thread t equals new port thread, and the host will be localhost. What am I doing? And the port will be I, just like that. So string integer. Now, what's it yelling at us about? It cannot be resolved to a type. It's saying, oh, it's not here. I can't find it. Port thread. Why can't I find it? Well, let's save it. See if it notices it's here at all. Spelled it right. THREAD, port thread, port thread. But we have a capital P. Java is very case sensitive, so that was my mistake. Port thread T equals new port thread, and then we pass it our parameters. Then T.start calls that run. So let's do it without T.start right now. Let's just run it and see what happens. Nothing exciting. T.start, however, calls that run method we have. So suddenly we have all this spam of things that are open, things that aren't open. And obviously that's not very effective for, I mean, we don't want to know all the ports that aren't open. If it tells us what ports are open, we can deduce what's not open. The reason I had this is so that we could show some kind of progress when it's really slow. When it's really fast, this actually just slows it down. So, let's try this again. And it'll tell us all the ports that are open. As you can see, that is quite a few ports. Let me make this a little bit bigger here. Port 445, 135, 554, 902, 912, 443. One disadvantage of this, 80 is open. There's a lot of ports on here that should be open, and a lot of them that shouldn't be open. But this is just a demo. But generally speaking, these are not going to be ordered. They're going to be in some kind of order. As you can see, most of the 3 digits are before most of the 4 digits, which if we scan further would be before most of the 5 digits if there were any 5-digit ports open on this computer, which there are not currently. But so I'm not scanning above 10,000. They're not open. But if you were to do a full scan, you would want to, of course, scan everything. But if you did want these to be in order displayed to the user, so it said 80, then said 135, then said 443, then 445, then 554. If you wanted it to be in order like that, all nice and neat, what you'd want to do is probably have each thread, if it is actually a port that is open, then it would append to a file the port that it found was open, and then this main program, after waiting maybe 2 seconds, would then jump in and say, hey all, and it'd read from the file, and then it would put everything in order. Or maybe you could even have the thread smart enough to read off all the data and sort it and insert their open port where it should be. But anyway, you would just kind of write it to a file and have each thread would write its own to a file if it found the port was open. Then this main program would just run around, grab the contents of that file, put it into an array list or something, use collections.sort on it, and then display it out to the user in a nice, numerically ordered way. And so obviously that can't happen here because the threads, while we do create the threads in a sequential order, 1 before 2, 2 before 3, 3 before 4, 4 before 10 trillion, some ports are a little bit faster on the response. So 445 might show up right before 443, as we saw earlier, or even 135 might show after the 400s. And so generally they'll stay in some kind of parameters of order, but no guarantees. If you really want them to be nice and ordered for anything, just save them, write them to a file and read them out is the easy way. Or you can also have all the threads kind of join back later on in this program, and we can communicate back and forth as to whether the port worked or not. So there's more robust and less robust ways to do this, of course. But that's the basics on how to use threads. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.